If you have a TransTRAX captive carrier that is not working at all, you should be able to turn the unit on and get the LED to come on. If, for whatever reason, you don't get it to come on, one of the first items you want to check is the circuit breaker. Has it been tripped? If it's been tripped, you can turn it off and turn it back on, and then check to see that your power on LED is on. Sometimes when they trip, they'll actually flip position, so you may want to turn it off, try it, and then turn it back on, and then try it just in case the rocker switch has tripped. If resetting the breaker does not fix the situation, open the left-hand door of the wall standoff, and inside will be the main control board. On the board there's a series of LEDs run right down the center of the board in the upper half. Each of these LEDs will give you an indication as to if the switch is tripping. Right now, the one marked PWR, which is your power switch, it comes on when I press the LED, or press the switch, indicating that the switch is working and that the board is seeing it work. If I were not getting the LED to come on when I press the switch, then I would need to open the plastic housing and inspect the switch and the wiring in between. It could be that we actually have a switch itself that has gone bad and might need to be replaced. To access the power on switch, if you do need to get to it to verify if there is a problem with the switch, you take off the front plastic housing just simply pull it off the front, and there is your push button assembly. 4 nuts hold it on. You can take the 4 nuts loose, lift it off, and get it right up to where you can actually work on it and test it. If you have a unit that will not recall or return back into the building when you hit recall or the customer hits the send button, you need to check to see if you're getting actual input into the building on the control board. If you press the recall button, you should see the RCL light come on the board. If the customer presses the customer send button, you should still see that same recall or RCL LED on the main board come on. If it's coming on, that tells you the switches are working. The other possibility as to why it doesn't recall would be if you had an inside stop switch that was on all the time. The inside stop switch is marked T-L as in teller limit. If that switch is on all the time, when you hit the recall, the board thinks that the carrier is already inside and ignores the recall or customer send buttons. If you have a situation where the carrier won't run out and you do have it inside the building, you want to check to make sure that you do not have the LED marked C-L, which is your customer limit, on. If it is on, it thinks the carrier is out at the customer end. If the other test you would want to do would be to send it to, or press the buttons for car, which would light the SND, the send LED, and press the one for truck, and it should light the TRK switch. All these switches being momentary, unless it is being tripped, that LED should be off. If you were to have one of the switches stuck on, either the TL, as it is seen here, or the CL for the customer end, or even the TR-L, which is actually the truck limit switch, which would prevent you from being able to send it out to the truck height or move it from the car up to the truck height. If any of these are on, you can actually remove the switch out to test and see if there is corrosion, or if the switch itself is bad, just disconnect it from the circuit and see if it would turn it off. To remove the switch, what you would do is take you a thin-bladed instrument, either a real skinny flat-bladed screwdriver or in this case a pocket knife, you would grab the little black dot, which is your stop switch, and come in at the 12 o'clock, hold it there, then come up at the 6 o'clock and hit the release pins that are mounted on the switch on both sides. And you should be able to pop it out and get to the connector. Earlier switches, this connector plugged right onto the back of the switch. Later versions, we actually have a disconnect on it that you can disconnect to see if your LED went out. In which case you have a bad switch and you would replace the switch itself. When you go to put it back in or replace it, make sure it's fully connected so it doesn't come back apart. Push it back in, and when you put it back in, make sure the release tabs are at the very top or the 12 o'clock position, and that makes it easier if you or somebody else has to come back and replace the switch at a later date. If you've reset the circuit breaker on the bottom of the unit and you still can't get the power lights to come on, once you've opened the door, look to see if there are any LEDs on the board. You should have a board active LED that's flashing, or the run limit should be on. If they are not, and you know the breaker has been reset, there's a chance that this fuse on the board has popped. What you would want to do is disconnect the AC power, and you can pull the rubber boot off of the fuse, pull the fuse out, and inspect to see if it is blown. If it is, you would want to replace it with a 10 amp 250 volt rated fuse. Once you've put all that back in and replaced the boot, you can plug your AC power back in and then try tripping the breaker to see if the LEDs come on. And the board active is flashing, which says the processor is running, and the run limit will tell you that the timer has not been tripped yet. On all the captive carriers, most all of the captive carriers, the audio LED could well be on. That is a function of the wiring to get the board to boot up in a captive carrier mode. This system is a 2-speed system. When the carrier runs out, it actually will speed up in a real-world installation where it runs along the horizontal for a longer distance than that, just to reduce the run time or the wait time for the customer. Being a 2-speed system, there has to be a set point at which it kicks in from low speed into high speed. And to tell the control board where the carrier is at, there is an LED, it's marked as chain, which will, if you watch it, will flash as the carrier runs. And what that is, there is a sensor mounted on the motor housing that sends a signal back up to here every time the motor does half a turn, or the output shaft does a half turn. Then the board here then counts the flashes to know when it needs to kick into high speed and then when to kick back out of high speed. The adjustment for these shift points is done on this main board by this slot for how long it stays into high speed. This one here controls how long it stays in low speed coming up the customer tube. And turning it clockwise will make it wait longer to shift into high speed. Counterclockwise will make it go into high speed earlier. The send one controls how long it's in low speed coming up the building tube, so that it can go up the building tube, around the turn, and then out of the airlock before it kicks into the high speed mode. Then high speed you want to set so that it goes into high speed once it's out of the airlock up in the canopy and before it gets to the turn to come back down the customer end. The recall mode, you would set it so it goes up the tube at the customer end and around the turn, and as soon as it hits the horizontal you want it to kick into high speed, so it runs along the horizontal and high speed, and then the high speed setting will also control when it kicks back down into slow speed, which should be before it gets to the doors and the airlock up in the canopy. If these are out of adjustment, one condition would be if the high speed's too short or it never gets into high speed, it makes a longer delivery time between the building and the customer end and vice versa. If it's set to where it's running in high speed too long, it actually can come down either the customer tube or the teller tube too fast, and it could trip the stop switches, but it will coast a lot further and could possibly crash into either the motor end or, if it's going out, to the speaker plate at the bottom of the customer end. So those settings need to be adjusted. If you ever replace the control board, you can pretty much eyeball where the settings are on one board and set the other board to it, and that would get you a good starting position to adjust from. If you have a situation where you try to hit the run and you get nothing, but you hear the click of the relays, but the motor just won't run. The usual situation, not always the case, but quite often what the situation is, on the captive carrier there is a brake assembly down here and a monitoring switch that tells the control board if the brake has released. What you can do is power the unit's powered on, the carrier's outside, so I'm going to do a recall. Press the recall button, it doesn't move. Unplug the two gray wires just below the transformer and then short the two pins together. If the carrier runs at that time, that tells me that we've got a brake switch issue. So what I would do then, if possible, I would hit the outbound move, get the car out of the way, then disassemble the motor cover to get into the motor assembly to inspect the brake switch. That will get us the front cover off, but we also need to get this rear cover off to inspect the actual brake solenoid and switch. That requires taking this fifth screw loose, which is captive. It'll just spin, pull down on the plastic and push back, and then pull it off. The brake assembly itself is off to the side of the unit. You may have something as simple as a wire that has become disconnected. We could have a bad switch, but the most common issue is the switch just needs adjusting. What you can do, in the recommended method for resetting the switch setting, the switch would be to grab the bracket and pull the bracket or push the bracket towards the switch just a little bit, so it bends the bracket just enough that it will then trip the switch. It is a very fine adjustment, and loosening and retightening the screws holding the switch would probably move it either too much or not, or possibly even in the wrong direction to make the unit work. Plug my brake back in. And now the assembly works. To replace the tape on the captive carrier with the car either inside or outside for the moment, you would go out to start at the customer end, remove the speaker plate by removing the one screw at the bottom, pulling down on it to disengage the plastic tab from the tape slot, set it off to the side with the wiring over out of the way. Then you would go into the building to manually move the car down. Once inside the building, open up the right-hand door on the wall standoff. And there is a brake control button. By pressing this button, it will release the brake that is on the motor. Take a flat-bladed screwdriver you can put it into one of the holes in the tape and slowly push it up while you're holding the brake release button. While you're doing this, the carrier will feed out of the customer end. Once the tape has disengaged from the motor, we can then just pull the tape completely out of the system. Then flip the car over, preferably onto a padded surface, and then you would remove the screws from the bottom of the car. Pay attention to which screws come out of which holes. As you'll see here in just a moment, there are different length screws on the car. To install your new tape, what you're going to do is you need to measure it out so that it is at least the same size as the original tape. Best way to do that is to line it up hole for hole and pull both tapes through your hand, keeping the holes lined up until you get to the end of it. Then you're going to cut the new tape with about a 15 to 20 degree taper to the end, so it has just a little bit of an arrowhead shape to the end of it. After you've snipped it off, there will be a little bit of a burr on the ends. Just take a file and dress the end over, kind of round it over. This will make it feed through the tape and through the tape slots in the aluminum track a lot better. Always want to make sure you start it correctly. This particular unit, the stops are going to be on the left-hand side when the car is at the bottom. So I'm going to make sure I keep the magnet on it off to that side. If you look at the bottom of the cars, both the gray car and the red car will have a hole pattern marked right on it. I'm going to put my first screw in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 holes from the end. Have an empty hole, a screw hole. Then we're going to go up. It's hard to read on this particular one. 23 holes, so we'll have 23 empty holes before we get to the next screw. Let me get my screws out of the old tape. And I left them in there so I knew which ones went to which holes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 empty holes. So I'm going to go into my 6th hole, push the tape in, the screw in, 1 empty hole, and push the screw through the tape. Go ahead and start this one. Most of the new tape kits, replacement tape kits, will usually come with new screws. I recommend using them as they have patches of Loctite on them to keep the screws from backing out on you while the machine's in use from vibration and temperature changes. I'm going to make sure that the screws are in square and centered to the tape. Now then, the next one is going to be 23 empty holes and then a screw. 1, 2, 3, 4. 23 So I'm going to go into hole 24. Make sure the tape and everything is reasonably straight. Then you just want to snug it. You don't want to over tighten it, as it will deform the plastic, could strip the unit out. You don't want to leave it loose for obvious reasons, and the screw heads can drag on the bottom of the tape tube in the unit. Take your tape, make sure you follow it out, find out which end is going to be towards the back side. Feed it back into the unit with the tape pressed all the way in. Carrier sitting on the ground here. Especially with the red car, what we're going to need to do is pull this trip lever in so that it can bypass the plastic stabilizer on the side of the tube. The gray car, this isn't an issue, as its trip lever flips both ways. What I recommend doing is taking a piece of masking tape, getting about 6 to 8 inches. I usually fold a little handle on the end so I can get it back apart. Attach it to the lever, kind of fold it over the end, push the lever down until it's flat against the bottom of the car, then just smooth the tape out along the side of the car to hold the lever in position. Once that's in position, and the carrier sitting at the bottom of the machine, I got the tape hitting on the motor. Now I'm going to go inside the building and pull the tape up into place. I'll hit the brake release and then pull on the tape. Press the brake release, take the flat-bladed screwdriver, put it into the hole and pull down on the hole, and it'll feed the tape around the motor. Yeah, there you go. As I'm pulling it up, it pulls the carrier into position. Onto the stabilizers. Once I get what I would prefer you do is you pull the car up so you get past the stabilizer. You can go ahead and stop at that point, go back to the outside end, remove your tape so the door is closed, and you should be able to go back in, turn the unit back on, and run the equipment to test run it. Verify everything's working. Go ahead and replace the speaker cover back at the customer end.